The morning of the county nuisance auction, there were 9 beavers nobody wanted, penned in a stock trailer parked crooked at the back of the fairground lot, and the light came down hard and flat across the gravel and the rust and the folding tables, and the men stood around with their coffee and their thumbs hooked in their belts, and they did not look at the trailer, because to look at it was to admit it was there, and nobody in that country wanted a beaver on their land any more than they wanted a fire in their kitchen. They had been live trapped off a stretch of ditch that fed the golf course and the new subdivision, and the trapper who caught them had a contract that said, relocate, not destroy, and he had spent 3 weeks failing to find a single soul who would sign for them, and now he stood by the tailgate, with a clipboard and a face like a man selling raffle tickets nobody would buy. And the animals inside the trailer moved slow and wet and heavy in the straw, 9 of them, a whole family, 2 big adults and a string of yearlings and kits, and they made a low churling sound that carried under the auctioneer's chatter, and every rancher who walked past that trailer walked past it the way you walk past a thing that is somebody else's problem. She did not walk past it. She stood at the rail with her gloved hands loose on the top pipe, and she looked in at them for a long time, at the flat black eyes and the orange teeth and the tails like river stones, and she did not say anything, because she was not a woman who said things before she had decided them. Her name was Rennie Vale, and she was 28 years old, and she had come back to the family place 4 months earlier, with a horse trailer full of nothing, and a truck that composed its own obituary every time it idled at a stop sign, and she had come back because there was nowhere else that was hers to go, and she stood at that rail in a cream Henley, gone soft at the collar, and a rust-brown chore jacket with the leather gloves already worn to the shape of her, and she watched the beavers, and the trapper watched her watching. He asked if she was buying or looking. She said she hadn't decided. He said he'd take $1 for the lot and haul them himself to wherever she pointed, because the alternative was a permit to put them down, and he did not want that on his sheet. And it was into that quiet that Cade Burnham walked, and Cade Burnham owned 4,000 acres of the best bottomland in the valley, and a voice built to fill a sale barn, and he saw where she was standing, and what she was standing at, and he laughed the laugh of a man who has never once in his life been wrong in public. He said, loud enough for the coffee drinkers to turn, that the Vale girl was finally going to finish what her whole family started, which was drowning that no-account ridge place one dumb idea at a time. And he said you put beavers on that dry creek, and by August you'll have a swamp where your hay ought to be, and a lawsuit from everybody downstream. And he said it like a weather report, flat and certain, that she would flood her own land and lose it, and the men laughed with him because it was easier than not laughing. She turned her head and looked at him with her dark eyes steady under the small pale scar in her right eyebrow, and she did not argue, because she had learned a long time ago that arguing was a way of agreeing to be measured on somebody else's scale. She said, that's one approach, and she signed the trapper's clipboard, and she gave him $1, and she pointed north toward the ridge, and Cade Burnham shook his head and told the crowd to remember he called it, that he called the funeral before the body was even cold, and his prediction hung there in the bright flat air, and it would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. And before I take you up the gravel road to the place she was bringing them home to, I want to ask you something small, and I mean it plain. If you have ever stood somewhere, holding on to a thing that a whole crowd of people had already decided was worthless, do me the kindness of tapping that like button, so this story finds the others like you, and leave a comment down below telling me the town, the city, or the country you are watching from tonight, because I read every single one of them, and it matters to me to know who is out there in the quiet, listening to a story about a woman and 9 animals nobody wanted, on a morning when the light came down hard and flat, and nobody would look. The family place sat at the top of a long gravel climb, where the county road gave up its blacktop and turned to washboard and dust, and it was 640 acres of ridge and draw, and a creek called 6 Mile that had not been 6 inches deep in living memory, and the house leaned a little south the way old houses do when they have been listening to the same wind for 100 years, and the barns leaned with it, and the fences went where the fences had always gone, whether or not the post still cared to stand. Rennie had grown up summers on that ridge, and then not at all, and she had come back to it after the bottom fell out of a life 2 states away, after the job and the man and the apartment all quietly stopped being hers in the same bad season, and she had driven the last of it up that gravel with a farrier's certificate in a folder she had never once used to make $1, and she had found the place the way you find a thing that has been waiting, patient and unbothered, sure you would come back eventually. The only living soul on it was her great-aunt Odell, who was 86 years old and had worn the same brown barn coat for longer than Rennie had been alive, and who said perhaps 1/10 of what she thought, and offered even that 1/10 the way you set a stone on a table, as a fact offered for consideration, and nothing more. Odell had watched her park that first afternoon, and had said only, "You're thinner," and had gone back to shelling peas into a chipped enamel bowl, and that had been the whole of the welcome, and it had been enough. Now the trapper's trailer came grinding up the gravel behind Rennie's dying truck, and Odell came out onto the porch and stood with her hands folded over her belt, and watched the trailer back down toward the dry stone throat of 6 Mile Creek, and she did not ask what was in it, because she could hear it, and she knew the sound of a beaver the way she knew the sound of rain, from a long way back. Rennie walked the 2 adults down first, one at a time in a transfer cage, and set them loose in the old dry channel where the creek used to run, before the whole valley started pumping the water table down past where roots could reach, and the big male stood a moment on the cracked mud and tested the air, and then went nosing up the dead channel like a man reading a deed. And the yearlings followed, and the kits followed them, and inside of an hour the 9 of them had disappeared into the willow scrub and the tumbled brush that lined the ditch, and the trapper looked at the dust and the leaning barns, and the woman in the chore jacket, and he said, "Honest, I hope you know something the rest of them don't," and he took his $1 and his empty trailer and left. That night, the emptiness of the place came up around the house the way it always did, an emptiness with texture to it, the tick of the cooling truck and the wind combing the ridge grass, and one screen door that would not stay latched, and Rennie sat at the kitchen table under a bulb the color of weak tea, while Odell knit something shapeless and slow, and Rennie said, "Lo, that Cade Burnham thinks I just bought a flood." And Odell knit 3 more stitches before she answered, and when she answered, she did not look up, and she said, "Cade Burnham thinks the water goes where the money tells it." And that was all she said, and it sat in the air the length of time it had earned. And then she said one more thing, quieter, almost to the yarn. She said, "Your great-grandfather Amos built the wrong kind of dam on purpose, and you'd do well to find out why, before you listen to a man who's never once let a creek finish a sentence." And Rennie turned that over and over, the wrong kind of dam on purpose, and she did not understand it, and she did not ask, because Odell had already gone back inside herself the way she did, and the house ticked and the wind combed the grass, and somewhere down in the dry throat of 6 Mile Creek, 9 animals nobody had wanted were beginning, in the dark, without permission and without an audience, to move the first sticks of a thing that would take a full turn of the year to mean anything at all. It rained a little in the 2nd week, a mean, thin rain that the ground drank before it could puddle, and Rennie spent those first days doing the work that was in front of her, which is the only work a person can honestly do, mending the fence along the county road where the wire had rusted through, hauling the last of Odell's split wood up under the eave, calming the one old mare who had come up the gravel with her and who spooked at the screen door every dusk, and Rennie calmed her the way she calmed everything, with a bare, ungloved hand flat on the neck, and a voice pitched low and even, no arguing in it, and the mare would drop her head and lean into the flat of her palm, and the 2 of them would stand there in the blue evening, until the fear went out of the animal and into the ground. And in the evenings, because Odell had said find out why, Rennie went into the back room of the leaning house, where the family had stacked a century of what it could not bring itself to throw away. And she went through it the way you go through the pockets of the dead, carefully, expecting nothing. And on the fourth evening, she found a wooden crate under a rolled rug, and in the crate were the ledgers of Amos Vale, 6 of them, cloth-bound and swollen with damp, filled edge to edge with a small, hard, slanting hand, and she carried them to the kitchen table, and she began to read. And what she read changed the shape of the year that was coming, though she could not have known it yet. Because Amos Vale had not been a man who wrote about his feelings. Amos Vale had written about water. He had written down the day the creek ran, and the day it quit, every year, for 40 years, and he had written the height of the grass in the north draw, and the depth of the well, and the number of days the stock tank held without hauling. And page after page he had built an argument with numbers, and the argument was this, that the valley was drying, not because the sky had turned against it, but because the men in it had spent 3 generations straightening every creek, and pulling every beaver, and draining every wet spot they called a nuisance, and that every straightened creek carried its water off the land faster, and every pulled beaver took 100 small dams out of the country, and every drained wet spot was a sponge somebody had wrung out and thrown away. And Amos had watched the water table fall a foot a decade, and had written, in a hand that pressed hard into the paper, "The water isn't gone, it's just not made to stay." And on a page near the back of the 3rd ledger, dated in a spring 50 years before Rennie was born, Amos had drawn a careful ink sketch of a beaver dam in cross-section, the way an engineer draws a thing he respects, showing how the pond behind it did not run off but sank, spreading sideways underground into the gravel and the roots and the long, slow memory of the aquifer, and beneath the sketch he had written a line and underlined it twice, hard enough to tear the paper a little, and the line said, "The ground remembers water if you let it." And Rennie read that line by the weak tea bulb with her thumb pressed to the torn place, and she read it again, and she felt the top of her scalp go cool, and she looked up, and Odell was standing in the doorway in her brown coat watching her, and Odell said, "So you found them?" And Rennie said, "You knew these were here." And Odell said, "I knew Amos, and knowing Amos was mostly waiting for somebody to finish what he started, and I am too old to be the one." And she came, and sat down heavy across the table, and put one finger on the torn underlined line, and she said, "He built the wrong kind of dam on purpose, meaning he quit fighting the beavers on this creek, back when everybody else was trapping theirs out. And he let one family stay in the north draw for 11 years, and he wrote down what it did, and it kept his wells full through the drought of the 50s, when Burnham's granddaddy was hauling water in a milk truck. And then Amos died, and the boys trapped the beavers out inside of a season, because that's what you did. That's what a real rancher did. And the wells started falling again the very next year. And nobody, she said, nobody ever once opened these books to ask why." And she took her finger off the line and folded her hands, and looked at Rennie across the swollen ledgers, and she said, as a fact offered for consideration, and no more, "You brought the water back today, and you didn't even know his name yet." And Rennie sat with that a long moment, and then she closed the ledger gently, the way you close a door on a sleeping house, and she said, "Then I'd better learn to read his hand." And outside in the dark the creek did not run, not yet, but down in the dry throat of it, the beavers were carrying willow. By the end of the first month, there was a mud line where there had never been a mud line. By the end of the second month, there was a pool the size of a kitchen table in the throat of 6 Mile Creek, dark and still and skinned with green, held back behind a low, tangled wall of willow and mud and stone, no higher than Rennie's knee. By the end of the third month, there were 3 pools, stepped one below the other down the draw like a staircase somebody was building out of water, each one behind its own low wall, each one a little wider than the last, and the willow scrub, that had been half dead, was throwing green whips a foot long, and a pair of mallards nobody had invited came down out of the sky, one grey afternoon, and settled onto the top pool as if they had a reservation, and Rennie stood on the bank and watched them, and did not smile, exactly, but something moved in her face that was close to it. She walked the ponds every morning before the work, and she read them the way Amos had taught her, across 50 years and a torn page. And she kept her own ledger now, a cheap spiral notebook she carried in the chest pocket of the Henley, and she wrote down the day the first pool held overnight, and the day the second one skinned with green, and the day she found the first wet, dark thumbprint of seep coming up in the north, draw 40 feet below the lowest dam, water she had not put there, and no rain had made, water coming up sideways, out of the ground, because the ground, exactly as Amos had written, had begun to remember. She wrote the seep down, and she underlined it twice, the way he had, and she did not tell anyone, because there was nothing yet to tell that a man like Cade Burnham could not laugh at. But the country tells itself, whether you feed it or not, because a country has a circulatory system, and the heart of this one was a woman named Fay, who ran the register at the 6-mile corner store, where the gravel met the blacktop, and Fay saw everything twice, once when it happened, and once when it came through her line as talk. And it was Fay who first said out loud, to a man buying diesel, that the Vale girl up on the ridge had put beavers on her creek on purpose, and was up there every morning tending them like a garden, and the man laughed and told 2 more men, and by the weekend it had traveled the whole valley that Rennie Vale was farming beavers, and half of them said it the way you'd say a person was farming rattlesnakes, and Cade Burnham said it the loudest, said he'd give her till the spring rise, said the first big rain those chewed-up brush dams would blow out all at once, and take her culvert and her county road access with them, said mark it down, said he'd bring his own backhoe to dig her out when she came crying. And he laughed, and the men laughed, and Fay rang up their diesel and their jerky, and kept her own counsel, because Fay had a longer memory than most, and she remembered Amos Vale's wells full in a dry year. And Rennie heard all of it, the way you hear weather, and she did not answer any of it, and instead she hired a boy. His name was Isaiah Tuck, and he was 15, and he lived down the ridge with too many brothers and not enough to do, and he had come up the gravel one Saturday on a bicycle, held together with baling wire, and asked if she needed help, and she had looked at his hands, which were already scarred and already sure, and she had said yes before he finished asking, and she had put him to work that same hour, hauling willow and setting the trail cameras she'd bought used, and she had treated him from the first minute as a man who already knew how, which is the only way anyone ever learns, and Odell had watched him work one afternoon from the porch and had said, without being asked, that one's got the hands, and had gone back to her knitting, and it would be a while before Rennie understood the full weight of what the old woman had said. The two of them, Rennie and the boy, spent that whole green stretch of the year down in the draw, not building the dams. The Beavers built the dams, but tending the edges of what the Beavers built, keeping the willow coming, keeping the fence back so the ponds could spread, keeping the cameras on the family of 9, and Isaiah counted 4 kits born that first spring on the ridge, and wrote it in his own hand at the back of Rennie's spiral notebook, and Rennie let him, because a ledger, while she was learning, is a thing you hand forward. And once, hauling a load of cut willow along the bank in the long gold evening, Isaiah asked her if it was true what they said in town, that she was going to flood everything, and Rennie set down her end of the willow and looked down the stepped staircase of dark pools with the mallards on the top one and the seep coming up in the draw, and she said, "Water walks slow when you let it, and it drowns fast when you don't," and Amos knew which one he was building, and she picked the willow back up, and that was the whole of the answer, and the boy carried it a long way. The trouble came in the back half of the summer, the way trouble comes, all at once and from the direction nobody was watching, and it did not come as the flood Cade Burnham had promised, and that was the first hinge of the whole year turning. It came as drought. The valley had been drying for 3 generations by the slow foot-a-decade arithmetic in Amos Vale's ledgers, but that particular summer the sky simply shut, and it did not open again from the middle of June clear through September, and the heat came down day after day like a hand pressing flat on the whole country, and the grass went from green to gold to grey, and the shallow wells started coughing air, and the big straightened irrigation creeks that Cade Burnham and men like him depended on, the creeks that carried their water off the land fast and clean, the way a good rancher was supposed to want. Those creeks carried their water off, and then had no more to carry, and they ran to gravel, and then to dust. And the bottomland that everybody in the valley agreed was the best land, the flat, rich, fought-for bottomland, began to burn up from underneath, because it had no memory left in it, nothing to draw on. Every drop of water it had ever been given, long since sent downstream in a hurry, by men who called standing water a nuisance and moving water a virtue. And up on the ridge, on the no-account place that a whole crowd had decided was worthless, the beaver ponds held. They held because a beaver pond is not built to run water off. It is built to hold it and sink it. And behind those low, chewed-up walls of willow and mud sat 3, then 4, then 5-stepped ponds full of dark, still water going quietly down into the gravel all summer long, and 40 feet below the lowest dam the seep in the north draw did not dry up. It widened, and the grass around it did not go grey. It stayed green in a long tongue running down the draw, green in a grey country, green you could see from the county road if you knew to look, and the mare grazed that green tongue all August, while every other pasture in the valley turned to ash, and Rennie's stock tank filled from the seep without a pump and without $1 of diesel, and she stood at the top of the draw in the terrible heat and watched her own land stay alive on water that a family of 9 unwanted animals had spent a year teaching the ground to keep. She did not gloat. There was no one to gloat to, and it was not in her to do it anyway. But she wrote it in the notebook, the date the last valley creek ran dry, and the date her seep was still running, side by side, and she underlined the 2 dates together, and she thought about Amos pressing his hard hand into the paper, 50 years gone, and she felt the thing the profile of her family had always felt at moments like this, which was not triumph, which was something older and quieter than triumph. The feeling of a person who was told for years that what she had was worth nothing, and lived long enough to watch the water prove otherwise. It was Fay who carried it out into the valley, of course. Fay at the register, who heard from the propane man, who had seen the green tongue in the drawer and could not make it make sense. And Fay said it plain to anyone who bought so much as a stick of gum, that the only pasture still green in the whole dry valley was the beaver place up on the Vale Ridge, the very place Cade Burnham swore would drown, and the talk went out, and it did not come back as a laugh this time. It came back as a question, and questions are how a country begins to correct its own judgment. And one blistering afternoon at the end of that August, a truck Rennie did not know came up the gravel and stopped at her gate, and a man got out with a state seal on his door and a clipboard of his own, and he introduced himself as a hydrologist the county had sent, because 3 shallow wells at the bottom of her drawer, wells that belonged to other people, wells that should have been dry as bone that summer like everyone else's, had come back up in July, had risen a foot and held, and nobody downhill could explain it, and he had traced it uphill on a map, and it had led him to her ponds. He walked the stepped staircase of water with her for 2 hours in the killing heat, and he crouched at the seep and put his hand in the cool of it, and he asked her how long, and she said 1 year this month. And he stood up slow and looked at the low chewed walls and the still dark water sinking into the gravel and the green tongue running down the grey drawer. And he said, "Quiet, the way one craftsman speaks to another when he recognizes work. He said, "Ma'am, people pay engineering firms a great deal of money to build what your animals built for $1, and most of the time, it doesn't work half this well." And Rennie said only, they had good instructions, and she did not explain, and he did not need her to. And he wrote her ponds down on his clipboard, and that was the first paper anyone but Amos had ever signed in favor of the wrong kind of dam. The word the hydrologist carried was different in kind from the word Fay carried, because Fay's word was wonder, and his word was proof. And proof travels slower, but it does not come back. And through that fall the two kinds of word met, and married out in the valley, and made something new, which was respect. And respect is the hardest thing to watch arrive, because it comes without apology, sideways, in small unwilling pieces. It came first as strangers slowing their trucks on the county road to look at the green draw, and then as a neighbor named Paul who owned the played-out quarter downhill, and who came up the gravel with his hat already in his hand, because it was his shallow well that had risen a foot in July, and he did not know how to thank a person for a thing he did not understand. So he brought a ham and set it on the porch rail and said his water was back, and he figured she had something to do with it, and Rennie said the Beavers did, and Paul looked down the drawer at the ponds and chewed on that and said, "Well," and left the ham, and that was a whole conversation in that country, and it meant more than a speech. And it came as the co-op forage buyer, who had heard from the hydrologist, driving up to look at hay Rennie had cut off the green draw in a summer, when almost nobody in the valley cut a bale, good heavy hay off ground that stayed alive, and he ran it through his hands and smelled it, and bought all of it at the top price, and asked could she grow more, and she said only as fast as the water can bear, which was Amos again, coming up out of her mouth the way the seep came up out of the ground. And it came, last and slowest and most, as Cade Burnham. He did not come in the fall. He was not a man built to move toward a thing he had called wrong in public, and it cost him something every dry week that summer and fall to drive past that green draw on his way to haul water to his own burnt bottomland. 4,000 acres of the best ground in the valley, gasping, while 640 acres of ridge that he had promised would drown, grew hay. And Rennie knew he drove past it, because Fay told her he did, and she never once said a word about it to anyone, because worth does not need to argue, it only needs to keep proving itself, and let the arithmetic do the rest. He came at last in the early winter, on a cold, still day when the ponds had a skin of first ice on them, and the beavers had gone quiet in the lodge they had built at the head of the top pool, a lodge as neat and engineered as anything in Amos's sketches, and Cade Burnham's big truck came up the gravel slow, and stopped at the gate, and he sat in it a while before he got out, and when he got out, he did not slam the door. And he walked down to where Rennie stood at the edge of the iced-over top pond in her chore jacket, with the boy Isaiah beside her. And he stood there a minute, looking at the ice and the lodge and the stepped ponds going down the draw, and he took off his hat, which Rennie had never in her life seen him do outdoors, and he said, "I came to tell you I was wrong." He did not make a large production out of it. He said his own wells were down 11 feet and hers were up, and he said he'd read that state report, the hydrologist's report, 3 times, and he said the thing that got him wasn't that it worked, it was that it had worked for Amos 50 years back, and the whole valley had trapped it out and forgotten on purpose, because a beaver was a nuisance, and everybody knew a beaver was a nuisance, and he said, "I helped trap this creek out myself when I was a boy. I was proud of it." And he stopped, and the cold, still air held it, and then he said, "If you ever want to try it on the lower creeks, the ones on my ground, I'll pay for the fence and I'll keep my mouth shut." And Rennie looked at him a long, steady moment under the small scar in her eyebrow, and she did not gloat, and she did not soften it into nothing either. She just held the line the way Odell held a line, and she said, "That's a good approach." And something went across Cade Burnham's hard face, that might have been relief, and he put his hat back on and walked back up to his truck. And that was the conversion. Ceremonyless. A man telling the future what it had been telling him, and the boy Isaiah watched the whole of it with his mouth a little open. And Rennie said to him, "Quiet, don't remember the part where he was wrong. Remember the part where he came and said so. That's the harder thing." And she wrote the date in the notebook, and she did not underline it, because some things weigh enough already. Odell died in the deep of that first winter, on a night with no drama in it, which was the only kind of night she would have allowed. She had been slowing all fall, saying even less than her 10th, sitting longer at the window with the knitting untouched in her lap, watching the light change over the ponds she could just see the top of from the kitchen. And one evening, she told Rennie she was tired, in a way that sleep didn't fix, and she said it the way she said everything, as a fact offered for consideration, and no more, and she asked Rennie to bring her the oldest of Amos's ledgers, the first one, and Rennie brought it, and Odell held it in her lap without opening it for a while, and then she said, "He used to read me the water numbers out loud like other men read scripture, and I thought it was foolishness, and I was wrong, the way you're always wrong about the people you outlive." And she handed the ledger back and she said, "Put me next to him, he'll want to know how it came out." And she died in her sleep 2 nights later, in the brown barn coat she would not be parted from, and the country came up the gravel for her, the way a country does when it has finished correcting its judgment. And Rennie stood at the little ridge cemetery, in a cold, clean wind, and heard the names of the mourners, the way you hear a door opening, Paul with his hat in his hand again, and Fay from the corner store, who cried without shame, and the co-op buyer, and the hydrologist who had driven 2 hours, and old couples from down the valley, whose wells had come back, and Isaiah Tuck, standing close with his scarred, sure hands folded, and Cade Burnham at the back, hat off, not making a production of it, and Rennie understood standing there that the roll of them was a kind of paper too, a deed of belonging, that the place had signed her in at last, and that the one person who would have been proudest to see it was the reason they were all standing in the cold, and she felt the 2 things bind together in her chest the way they always bind, the grief and the triumph, the water proved, and the woman who'd taught her to wait for it, gone under the same ground that had finally remembered. After the burying, sorting the house, Rennie found the thing Odell had left for her, and it was the open-loop closing, because tucked in the front of Amos's first ledger, where Odell had held it that last evening, was a sealed envelope in the old woman's hand, and on the front of it, underlined once, were 2 words, and the 2 words were, "Not yet." And Rennie sat on the floor of the emptied house and turned that envelope over and over, "Not yet," and she did not open it, because Odell had underlined it, and Odell had never in her life underlined a thing she didn't mean. And Rennie understood that it was an instruction and not a riddle, that the old woman was telling her from the far side of the ground that whatever was in the envelope was for a day that had not come, and she put it back in the ledger and she waited, because waiting was the whole art of that family, and she had married into it by staying. And the winter went on the way winters go, and the ponds froze thick, and the beavers lived under the ice on the willow they'd stored, exactly as Amos had drawn it, 50 years gone. And Rennie and the boy did the winter work, and in the coldest week, the old failing truck finally quit for good in the yard, idling out its long obituary one last time, and then simply stopping, and Rennie stood over it a while, and then let it be, because she had learned by then that the way you got new things in that country was not by borrowing against the old, and she had money now from the hay and the forage buyer, and none of it was borrowed, and she meant to keep it that way. And that was the thing the valley never quite understood about her even then, that when the co-op offered to finance an expansion and the bank sent a man up the gravel to talk about a loan against the newly valuable ground, she said no, both times, plain and unbothered. And when the bankman pushed and said, Everybody grows on credit. That's how it's done. She said a thing that Isaiah wrote in the back of the notebook that same night, because it stopped him where he stood. She said, "Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do, and my great-grandfather spent 40 years teaching this ground to keep its own water, and I'm not about to hand its future to a man in town who's never once let a creek finish a sentence, and the bankman did not know what to do with that, and he left, and the ground kept its water, and she grew only as fast as the work could bear. The second year the ponds spread, and the third year they spread further, and the thing that had been a wonder became, slowly, a way, and the way had a shape to it that Amos had drawn, and Rennie followed, and Isaiah learned, and it went out from the ridge the way water goes, sideways, and patient, and without an advertisement. Cade Burnham kept his word and paid for the fence and kept his mouth shut, and Rennie and Isaiah put a family of beavers on the lower creeks of his 4,000 acres in the second spring, and it took 2 years, and it was not simple, and one dam did blow out in a hard rise and had to be let rebuild. But by the third summer, Cade Burnham's shallow wells were up 4 feet, and his bottomland stayed green a month longer into the dry than his neighbors, and Cade Burnham, who had once called the funeral before the body was cold, became, in his blunt, unlikely way, the loudest voice in the valley for the wrong kind of dam. And he told the story on himself at the co-op and the sale barn, told how he'd mocked the Vale girl and her 9 beavers, and how the drought had made a fool of him and a prophet of a dead man's ledger, and he did not soften his own part in it, and Rennie let him tell it, because a skeptic converted is worth more carrying the word than a believer born to it. And other ranchers came up the gravel, 1 and 2 at a time, hats in hands, to walk the stepped ponds with Rennie and the boy and to ask, and Rennie showed them everything and charged them nothing but attention, and she gave each of them a photocopy of the cross-section sketch from Amos's third ledger, the pond sinking sideways into the gravel, the underlined line beneath it, "The ground remembers water if you let it," and she watched grown men read that line and go quiet, and the valley began, creek by creek and well by well, to unstraighten itself, to let the wet spots be wet and the beavers stay, to remember on purpose what it had spent 3 generations forgetting on purpose, and the water table under the whole country, which had fallen a foot a decade for as long as anyone had measured, stopped falling, and in the 5th year it came up an inch, and the hydrologist drove up the gravel to tell Rennie that himself, because he thought she should hear it from a man holding the measurement, and she wrote it in the notebook and she underlined it twice, hard, the way Amos would have, and she thought her great-grandfather had waited 50 years under the ground to see an inch, and it was enough, and she thought Odell had said he'll want to know how it came out, and she went up to the Ridge Cemetery that evening and stood between the 2 graves in the long gold light and told them the number out loud, the way Amos used to read the water numbers to Odell like scripture, and neither of them answered, and both of them heard, and the wind combed the grass. And the day came, in that 5th spring, that Rennie understood the envelope. Isaiah Tuck was 20 now, and he had grown into the sure hands Odell had marked at 15, and he could read a creek as well as Rennie could, and better than Amos's ledgers, because he could read the ledgers and the creek both. And there was a piece of ground the next valley over, a dry played-out place with a dead creek and a leaning house, that had come up for sale for nothing, because nobody wanted it. And Isaiah stood in Rennie's kitchen with the co-op check from the hay in his hand, his own money, none of it borrowed, and he told her he was going to buy it and do to it what she had done to the ridge, and he was scared. She could see he was scared, the way she had been scared, standing at that auction rail 6 years back with a crowd laughing behind her, and it was then that Rennie went and got Amos's first ledger and took out the sealed envelope with the 2 underlined words on the front, "Not yet," and she turned it over in her hands, and she understood that this was the day, that Odell had known there would be a day when the hands she'd marked would need what was inside, and Rennie handed it to the boy unopened and said, My great-aunt left this for a day that hadn't come, and I think it's yours to open, not mine." And Isaiah opened it with his sure, scarred hands, and inside was a single sheet in Odell's economical hand, and on it she had written, "For the one with the hands, when he's afraid." And beneath that, the whole of the wisdom she had hoarded her whole life, and spent 1/10 of, she had written, "Worth doesn't argue, it waits, and the ground remembers, and so will the people, last of all and slowest, but they will." And Isaiah stood in the kitchen and read it twice and could not speak, and Rennie let the silence sit the length of time it had earned. He named the place, the boy did, when he bought it, and he asked Rennie to come the day the trailer brought the Beavers, 4 of them this time, off a nuisance line 2 counties over. Animals nobody wanted, hauled by a trapper glad to be rid of them. And Rennie drove over the next valley in the truck she had finally bought with cash, after the old one composed its last obituary in her yard. And she stood at the edge of a dry, dead creek in her rust-brown chore jacket, with her black braid over her shoulder, and the small pale scar in her eyebrow gone silver in the years. And she watched a 20-year-old with sure hands set 4 unwanted animals loose in a dry channel, while a small crowd of the next valley's ranchers stood back with their coffee and their doubt. Because every valley has to correct its own judgment one at a time, and no valley learns it from another's proof. And she heard, off at the edge of that crowd, a prosperous man say loud that the tuck boy was going to flood his own ground inside of a year, and she heard the laugh go through the crowd, the way it always goes, and she felt the whole shape of it come around, the cycle closing, the same bright flat light, and the same devalued lot of living things, and the same quiet person, seeing what the crowd would not, and she did not go and argue with the loud man, because Worth does not argue, and instead she walked down to where Isaiah stood, watching his 4 beavers nose up the dead channel, reading it like a deed. And she stood beside him, and after a while she said the thing Odell would have said. She said it as a fact offered for consideration, and no more, she said. "They'll laugh for about a year, and then the water will come up in somebody's well who didn't ask for it, and after that it's just arithmetic." And the boy nodded, and the 2 of them stood at the rail of a dry creek in a doubting country, and watched the first sticks get carried, and it looked like nothing, the way it always looks like nothing, the way it had looked like nothing 6 years and a whole turned life ago, on the morning nobody would look at a trailer full of animals nobody wanted. And that is nearly the whole of it. The ridge green now, where it was grey, the wells up where they were falling, the ledgers of a dead man read at last, and copied and carried valley to valley. The wrong kind of dam proved right by the only judge that never lies, which is a dry August, and 2 graves on a ridge that heard the number and did not answer, and a girl who came up a gravel road with nothing but nowhere else to be, and stayed long enough to watch a whole country correct itself, 1 unwilling inch at a time. She did not name the beavers, in all those years, because you do not name the working animals. Wish she held that line. She held it hard. She almost held it. There was one, the old male from that first family of 9, the one who had stepped onto the cracked mud that first afternoon and tested the air and read the dry channel like a deed, who lived 11 years on the ridge and built the whole stepped staircase of water that saved the place. And when he died at last of nothing but age, Rennie found him at the head of the top pond, and she buried him herself on the bank of the water he'd made, and she gave him the one name she'd withheld from all the rest across all the years, and she wrote it once in the notebook and never again, and the name she gave him was Amos, and she underlined it twice. So I'll leave you the way she'd want, which is with the work still going, and the water still walking, and no big production made of any of it. But before you go, I'm going to ask you the small, sincere thing I promised I would. If this story reached something in you, send it to someone you know who's been underestimated, someone standing right now at their own rail, holding on to a thing a whole crowd already decided was worthless, because they need to hear that worth doesn't argue, it waits, and the ground remembers, and so will the people, last of all and slowest, but they will. And do me one more kindness down in the comments. Tell me about the stubborn thing in your own life that they laughed at, the beavers on your own dry creek, the idea, or the place, or the person everybody told you would flood your land, and tell me whether the waters come up yet, or whether you're still in the year where it all just looks like nothing. Because I read every single one, and I have learned, from a woman on a ridge and a dead man's ledger and 9 animals nobody wanted, that the thing that looks like nothing on the morning the light comes down hard and flat is very often the thing that turns out to have been everything, and that all it ever needed was somebody willing to let the creek finish its sentence.